disconnect the negative terminal on the battery. Just use an 8mm wrench. And slide that to the side. Underneath, we want to drain the coolant out. There's no drain on the radiator, so underneath where the lower radiator hose is, you want to put a drain bucket, and we'll use some hose clamp pliers. Loosen up the hose clamp. You want to make sure this is also cold. The engine's cold when you do this. You don't want to do this with hot coolant. Loosen that up. And then just grab the hose. Try to rock it back and forth a little bit. And be careful not to splash yourself. If you squeeze this hose clamp far, it will lock in place. So just use some different hose clamp pliers, and you can slide that off. It's a little bit easier. And just let the coolant drain out nice and slow. We need to separate the transmission lines from the radiator. Just pop these little caps off. You can use a trim tool or a screwdriver. There's clips in here. You need to take the clips out. There is special tools you can use, or you can use a pick. Just slide beside the clip. Just try to pop it out. This is what the clip looks like. And take this clip out as well. Just grab the lines and just shake them. Try to pry these out a little bit. There we go. Pop it off. You might need a drain bucket if some fluid comes out. Do the same on this one. Oh, there we go. Get that off. Remove the wheel. We're going to take this cap off first. Just use a straight blade screwdriver. Pop that off. Use a 19mm socket. Take the lug nuts off. Take the wheel off. I'm going to take the axle nut off. Use a 36mm socket. And you might want to just tap this with a hammer. Use a punch so that you don't ruin the threads. But just make sure this is loose, which it is. There's a retainer right here on this bracket. We want to take that off. Just use some needle nose pliers and just squeeze that, slide that off. Pop this clip off right here. I'm just going to use a pocket screwdriver. Just slide that out. There's another retainer over here. You can either pop the retainer off or use a trim tool and just pop it out. So I'll just open it up, take that out. There's another retainer right here. I'll just pop that open. Slide that out. Just gonna take a trim tool and just slide the connector out. Make it a little easier to disconnect. And slide that off. I'll just move this out of the way. We're just trying to get some slack so that we don't ruin the hose. Ruin the cable. There's two bolts right here and here. Use a 10mm socket. Take those bolts out. Slide that off. That just gives you some more slack with the brake hose. Now we're going to take this nut off for the tie rod end. Use a pick if you need to take the cotter pin out, or just break it off. Now use a 21mm socket, take the nut off. We need to separate the tie rod from the knuckle. You can use a pickle fork in there and separate it that way. The downfall of that is you may rip the boot. And there's other front end tools that you could use that will grab onto here and press this down. What I like to do is just take the nut, put the nut back on here, just so the end of the stud doesn't mushroom out, and then take a hammer and give it a bunch of taps. Sometimes it pops out. If it doesn't pop out on the second or third hit, you probably want to try another one of those tools because you don't want to mess up the threads on the end of the tie rod. Now we can take this off. Slide that out. Now I'm going to take the caliper off with the bracket. So take these bracket bolts off, use an 18mm socket. Slide the bracket and the caliper off the rotor. Might have to use a pry bar. Just get underneath there. And use a brake caliper hanger and hang the caliper from the coil spring. And take the rotor off. Take a 24mm socket, take this nut off. I'm actually going to leave it on a couple threads because we got to separate the knuckle from the ball joint. And you can do this the same as the tie rod end. Use either a fork or some type of front end tool where you can press this out. Do the best you can. Sometimes you can just take a hammer and give it a tap right here. You don't want to hit it too hard because you don't want to break anything, but sometimes it will dislodge it. There we go. Not too bad. If you do that too many times, though, you want to use the tool instead. I'm going to use a 15mm socket and a 15mm wrench. Take this bolt out. Now I'm just going to take a pry bar and just go in between here, just spread this apart a little bit. And as you do that, you can separate the upper control arm from the ball joint. Just be careful, this is going to tip forward once it's completely separated. Just like that. Just tap on this a little bit. And then I'm going to just support this knuckle while I take that nut off and then set the whole knuckle aside. And slide it off. Underneath, take this cover off, use a 13mm socket, take these bolts out. Slide that down. Now from the back side, if you have a fork that you can separate the axle from the differential, you can try that, or just use a big punch. Get underneath here. You might want to put a drain bucket underneath. There may be some fluid that comes out. There we go, popped out. Took a little effort. And slide that out. And then you're going to do the same on the other side. We're going to take this bracket off. We need to take these bolts off. Use a 15mm socket. There's two over here. You want to do this on both sides. Up here on each side there's 3 bolts. You want to use a 15mm socket, take those 3 bolts out. And there is one that's going to be shorter than the other two. So just keep that in mind. See, that one's a little bit longer. And that one's shorter. So there's two shorter ones. You have the longer one that goes down below, and you have the two shorter ones up top. We'll do the same on this side. And you can take this piece out, just pry underneath it with a pry bar. Just slide that out. Now we're going to take these two bolts out on both sides. Because you're taking these bolts out, after you're done this job, you're going to need to get the vehicle aligned because you don't want premature tire wear, because this is going to change the adjustment on the lower control arm. So keep that in mind. Use a 21mm socket. I'm just going to leave this bolt in on this side a couple threads while I take the other side apart. All right, this one's a little rusty, so I just got to give it a tap. But normally it'll come down pretty easily. Now I can take the bolt out. Slide that down. We're going to take the drive shaft off. Before I do that, I just want to mark where it was when we take it apart. It's always a good idea to mark it. Use some kind of crayon or marker. That way when you put it back together, it's as close as it was as possible. And use an 11mm socket. Take these bolts out. We'll spin this and take these out. Slide that off. And then take a pry bar, just get in between here. Just want to pry it out. There we go. And just try not to lose the cap for the U-joint. These caps sometimes fall off. Right here near the transfer case, we can just tap it out. Just give it a couple taps. And you can use a pry bar. Just pry it out the rest of the way. And just slide it out of the way. Want to make sure the steering wheel is centered. You can just take the seatbelt and go through with this, and then just buckle the seatbelt. That's going to prevent the steering wheel from spinning. And you want to double check on the steering rack that the boots look like they're the same distance apart. You want to take a tape measure or a ruler and just see the distance for how far out this boot is for the steering rack. So about 5 inches there and about 5 inches there. So that's even. Just make sure that's even. Now I just grab this boot right here. It's going to separate. Slide the other boot up, and then you can access the bolt right there. And then I can access this bolt from the side. There's a little flap you just lift up, and use a 15mm socket. Take that bolt out. Where the power steering lines go into the steering rack, you need to take that bolt out. There's an 8mm bolt. Just use an 8mm socket. And you can access it through the hole where the axle was for the driver's side. Loosen that bolt up. And you're going to want a drain bucket underneath here when you pull the lines off, because you're going to lose some fluid. Slide that bolt out. And just pry those off. And there's the fluid. Now I did just support the rack just with a screw jack just to prevent it from falling. We have to take these two bolts out up top. Use a 21mm socket on this side of the bolt. On the other side of the bolt there is a nut, so if you use a 21mm socket with a ratchet, you can hold the nut from spinning. And just take it off. And you can take the bolt out, use a magnet, or you can punch it through from the other side. Take both of those out. Now I can lower the screw jack and just start lowering the rack. It's probably not going to fall, but just in case, you can use a pry bar. Just pry it down a little bit. Let's go back and forth. I want to make sure it slides off up top. And it looks like it's sliding good. And pry it down over here. And slide it right out. Disconnect the connector on the actuator. You can access it from underneath. If there's a little retainer or a lock, you have to slide that down and then push down on the button. Slide that connector off. Now we'll take these two bolts out, use an 8mm socket. Take the lower one out as well. There's a little pressure behind this. This must be engaged at this time, but make sure the battery's disconnected. Either way, and slide that off. Now we're going to take some of these bolts off. We don't have to take all of them. Use a 15mm socket. Take this one out. Take this lower one out. Take this top one out. And then this lower one in the corner. So there's 4. All right, now you want to pry this out. Just be careful. You don't want to break any of the ears off. That should come out. You need to pull this shaft all the way through. If you can grab onto it and pull it out, that works. If not, I just took one of the 10mm bolts and just threaded it in. Just tightened it down as tight as I could get it. And then I'm going to take a trim tool, slide right there, and then a pry bar, and just pry it out. And it comes out pretty easily. And slide the shaft out. Use an 18mm socket or a wrench. Take these bolts, loosen them up, take them out. This one you definitely need a wrench for. You can't get a socket in there. That's just going to sit like that. You can't take that out. And there's another one up here. And double check, there should be one more right next to this, a little bit further up, that you can get with a socket and an extension. And then very carefully, just pry this out with a pry bar. If it seems like it's pretty tight, then just double check, make sure you got all the bolts out for that. They should be just the 18mm. This This one's actually moving a little bit. You could use 2 pry bars too. Just go back and forth. I'm just going to put a support under here. It's really not going to fall, it's just going to move to the side, but just so it doesn't damage anything. And just pry back and forth. There we go. This front differential, I'm not taking it out, but I want this to stay close to the frame, so I'm just going to use some tie-down straps and wrap it around it. Keep it in that location, just so it doesn't move, so it doesn't fall or get in my way. It kind of keeps it out of the way too. So just go around the frame. Just kind of strap this over here. Then I'll be able to move the screw jack as well. We have to take the lower compressor bolts out, right there and there. Use a 15mm socket. Take those out. And take those out. Now I'm going to drain the oil. Make sure you have a drain bucket underneath. Use a 13mm wrench or socket. Take the drain plug out. And drain the oil. And I'll put the drain plug back in. And snug that down. Now we're going to take these bell housing bolts out. They're just the lower 4s, 1, 2, 3, 4, and use a 15mm socket. That one, I'm going to need an extension for that one. This rubber grommet right here, just take a screwdriver. I'm just going to pry this out. All right, pull that out. There's 2 bolts up there. You need to use a 10mm socket. Take those off. Oops, get those out. Then around the perimeter of the oil pan, there is 13mm bolts you need to take out. On the sides, in the front of the oil pan, there should be 10mm ones. So use a 10mm socket to take those out, and then take all of these out as well. In the front, that's where the 10mm bolts are. You can try to get on there with a swivel socket and take those out. Or you can try to access them from in the front and just use a socket and a ratchet. Now we need to pry this down. It is glued up there with RTV. So there's a couple prying spots that you can get in. Use a pry bar. An area right here you can pry from. Just be careful, because you don't want to pry too much and crack something. Just go slow. Make sure you support it. Keep it from falling. Just work it back and forth. Just slide it down a little bit. slide it down. I'm going to remove the oil pickup. There's a 10mm bolt here, and there's another 10mm bolt over here. Take those off with a 10mm socket. Just like that. There's a little gasket there too. Slide that off. Take this radiator hose off. We're going to use the hose clamps. Move these hose clamps. If you squeeze them all the way, they kind of lock. Just be careful of your fingers. Oh, sometimes you just have to hold them. Move it down. Slide that off. And then I'm going to pop this one off as well. Slide that off. And just grab the hose, give it a twist. If you can't twist the hose off, you can get in there with a pick, like a 90-degree pick, and just loosen it up. Want to loosen up the fan clutch. You want to use some type of fan clutch tool. This one is a 36mm. Set that up. This one attaches to the air hammer, and just loosen it up a little bit. There we go. You just gotta crack it free. And you can loosen up the rest by hand, although we're not gonna be able to move it because the cage is gonna be in the way, the fan shroud. Disconnect this connector right here. Push down on the tab, slide it back. If there's a little lock tab on there, you gotta push that back. Use a 10mm socket, take these two bolts out up on top. Slide that bolt out. Do the same on the other one. You want to pop these lines out of this bracket right here. You can use a pry bar or a screwdriver. Just pry those back out of the way a little bit. There's a push pin right here. Just pop that off. There is a push pin on the bottom as well. That one you could just slide off. Like that. Just get underneath there with a screwdriver or a pry bar. Slide that out. And then you just want to slide this up a little bit just to get it loose. Now we'll loosen up the fan. It's probably going to rub on the shroud. Pop off. Slide it out of the way a little bit. And grab the fan shroud, slide up. And you kind of got to work together with the fan shroud and the fan. We have to get over this area of the radiator. Just be careful. Just push that forward. And kind of work it together. Watch the water pump if the fan gets stuck on the bolts. And it slides right out. Using a belt tensioner tool or even a 3/8 drive ratchet, you want to go over to the tensioner, and there's a spot right here where that goes. Loosen the tension on the tensioner, and then you can take the belt off. Take it off the power steering pulley first. Then you can loosen the tension on the tensioner. Take that tool off. Take the belt off the alternator, off the idler pulley, off the AC compressor, off the water pump, and then off the crank pulley. And slide it out. Take the tensioner off, use a 15mm socket, take this bolt out. Slide that out. Take off this pulley, use a 13mm socket. Take these bolts out. Just going to use a pry bar. This is stuck on there. Normally you should be able to take this off fairly easily. Slide that off. Take these bolts out. Use a 10mm socket. That's it. There's 5 bolts. Grab the water pump and just slide out. You might want a drain bucket underneath in case you lose some fluid. We want to take the top part of the airbox off. Use a Phillips head screwdriver. There's 3 screws. Loosen these screws up. There's one here, and one here. Loosen those up. Grab the box and wiggle it up, just like that. Take a straight blade screwdriver, loosen up the worm clamp right here. And disconnect the connector right here. Push down on the tab, slide it off. You can grab the snorkel, slide it back. And there's a connection right here. Just push on these 2 tabs and that slides off. Take this wire off, just use a straight blade screwdriver and just pop this off. Slide that out of the way. Take these 2 bolts out, use a 10mm socket. Slide those out. Loosen up this worm clamp right here on the throttle body. Then we can grab this intake, slide it up. There is a hose that's connected right there. Pop that hose off. Disconnect the connector right here. Just push down on the tab. And try to slide it off. Push down on the tab and slide it off, and disconnect the connector for the map sensor. Just push that up, slide that off, just push that harness out of the way. There's a hose right here, disconnect that hose. There's a little lever, push down on the lever. When you push down on the lever, you can slide it back. I'm going to take this computer off of the intake. There's a bolt here, and a nut down below, and a nut down below. Use a 10mm socket, take all those off. And slide that off. Now I'm going to use a 7mm socket, loosen up the bolts that hold the connectors on, and disconnect the connectors. Just like that. There is a seal here, so you want to make sure that seal goes around the connector. You don't lose that. And do the same for the other 2. Those are all disconnected. Take that computer and set it aside. All these wires that are connected to this bracket, you want to pop those off. There's a couple of retainers. There's one down here. You can pop the retainer open or just pop the retainer off. Just get them off. There's a bolt right here. This one's extremely rusty, so this should just be a 10mm bolt. Pull that bolt off. Or you can just take the bracket off. Slide that wire out of the way. And this retainer right here, just open this up with a straight blade screwdriver, or you can get underneath it. So basically anything attached to this bracket. All right, so that's separated there. Take this bolt out here, use a 10mm socket. Take this bracket off. There's two 15mm bolts right here and here. Take those off. And there's a bolt on the back side here. Use the same 15mm socket. And slide that bracket off. Now take the bolts out for the alternator. Use a 15mm socket. It's 3 bolts for the alternator. I'm going to disconnect the connector on the alternator right here. Just lift this up. You can use a pocket screwdriver. Slide that connector off. Then under here, lift this boot up. Take that nut off. Use a 10mm socket. Take that nut off. Slide it out and slide the alternator out. Underneath the bracket there's some wires that are connected. Just use a trim tool and disconnect those from that bracket. Separate those. Then if you follow along the bracket, you can feel where there is a bolt down there. It's kind of hard to see. And I'm just using a 10mm socket to take that bolt out. There's not much you can see. Just try to move those wires out of the way. Okay, that's off. There's another wire that's attached to the bracket here. Use a trim tool, take that off. Out of the way, and then down here there's a little vent that goes to the differential. I'm going to pop that bracket off as well. That's out of the way, everything's loose. I'm going to take these studs off, use a 4mm socket. And I'll take this one off as well. Oh, it just broke. All right, I'm not taking that one off because it broke. And bracket's loose. Just try to slide everything out of the way. That bracket off, it opens it up a little more. Take this hose off right here. This goes to the brake booster. Just use some hose clamp pliers and just slide it off. Just like that, and just slide it out of the way. Use a 10mm socket, take the throttle body off. Slide that out of the way. Now we're going to take the bolts out of the intake, use a 10mm socket, and every other row there will be a double where there's 2 bolts. So you'll have one at the base and then one higher up. I'll show you a little bit better when the intake's out. Take those bolts out. And they are They are caged bolts, so you just got to get them loose. So they're not going to be able to pull out in your hand. In the middle here, there's this hose. You could take some hose clamp pliers or some hose pliers and just try to move this off, because there's a bolt behind there you have to get. Slide that off and then out of the way. You can just twist it. And this should be the last bolt for me. And just pull it out. You're gonna have to tip it a little bit. Slide it past the fuel rail. You can disconnect the fuel rail. That'll give you a little more room. I just don't want the fumes, so I'm just gonna get it past without disconnecting it. But if it makes it a lot easier for you, just disconnect it. And it slides right out. Now take this nut off over here where the dipstick tube is. There's a bracket. And slide the dipstick tube bracket out of the way. If you want, you can slide the dipstick tube out if it comes out easily, or just set it aside. And then take this other stud off. Use the same 10mm socket. Take that out. Now this pipe can move a little easily out of the way a little bit. Just like that. There's some wiring harnesses over here. Disconnect this connector right here. There's a little lock tab on there. Let's slide it up. Connector right here. Disconnect that. And then the connector over here. Slide up on the lock and slide it out. There's a retainer right there, just take that off. And then slide these wires out of the way. And there's some brackets right here. You might have to get under here with a trim tool. Just slide up. There is a wire that goes, if you follow it, goes down here. There's a clip, retainer, take that off. And if you want to, you can disconnect the connector for this wire. You're gonna have to reach way down low. You might have an easier time reaching it from the front. There's nothing you can see. It's attached to an oil pressure switch way down near the oil filter. You might be able to get it from underneath. Just slide that off. If you disconnect that, it's just going to be easier to move this harness out of the way. You don't necessarily have to, but it'll just be easier in the long run. Now we'll disconnect all the coil packs. Slide those locks up, just disconnect those. Disconnect this connector here. This goes to the fuel injectors. And then also, some vehicles may not have this connector here. This is for the EGR valve. Slide that off. Out of the way. There's another retainer right here. You can pop that off. And just slide that harness out of the way. Over there near the connector for the injectors, just pop this harness off of there. Now we're going to take all the coils out, use a 10mm socket. Just grab the coil, slide it out, do the same with the other ones. Now I'm going to take all these bolts out for the valve cover. They're all 10mm, use a 10mm socket. Now just go under here with a scraper or some type of pry bar. Just be careful, don't ruin any of the surfaces. Just pry this up. Just have this hose out of the way. And slide off this valve cover. And if any of these gaskets stuck down to the head, just take those off. Before I go any further, I just want to time the engine so it's at top dead center. There's a timing mark right there. There's also one right here on the cam sprockets. And then I'll take a 24mm socket. Then I can rotate the engine over. And if you look in the back here, on the back sides of the cams, this is where, if you have the proper tool, you can line up the tool, or you can use a straight edge, like I'm using here, just a ruler, and you want those to line up. The tool is going to look similar to this, but just longer. This one's not going to work. This one's for a different GM vehicle. But it just needs to be so that it's flat. So the cams are flat. That's pretty close. So that's in the vicinity of it, maybe a little further. Oh, a little too far. If you go backwards, you don't want to go back very far at all. You could damage the timing chain, or the timing chain could skip a tooth. That looks good. So this has to be flat, and this has to be flat. Very close. Take this bar off, use a 10mm socket, take this bolt out, and then the one on the other side of the battery. These two bolts, use a 10mm socket. There's two bolts here, and there's two right here and two right here. Use a 13mm socket, take all those bolts out. Grab this cross member and just slide it out. Take this retainer off right here. Slide that wire harness out of the way. Take a trim tool, slide the clips out. You can take a pair of pliers and from the back side, just squeeze the clips. Pop those off. Underneath, you're just going to have to grab and try to pull. And slide that off. On the back side of here, there is a 13mm bolt. You're going to have to use a 13mm socket. And it's not something you can see. It's just behind here, so go down here and you'll be able to feel it. It's connected to this piece right here. So take that out. Just be careful, you don't want to ruin the condenser. Once you get it loose, you should be able to do it by hand. Take that bolt out. You can grab this piece and just slide it out of the way. There's a hose right here. Should be able to just take that off, slide that out of the way. And there's two bolts on both sides of the radiator. Take those out. Use a 10mm socket. Grab the condenser, just slide it up. There is some brackets at the bottom of the radiator. Slide that out, then you can grab the radiator, slide it out. Now we're going to take a 24mm socket, take this bolt out with an impact gun, If you have a impact gun that's shorter than this, then you don't necessarily have to take the radiator out, but we took it out just so we could get in there. Loosen this bolt up. And take that nut off, or bolt off. Now I'm going to use a Harmonic balance puller. Line this up. It slides right off. Now we'll take this cover off, use a 10mm socket, take all the 10mm bolts out. Some of these are longer than others, so you might want to keep in mind where the longer ones go. Now just take a pry bar. There's a little ear right here. Just be careful. Just pry this back a little bit. There's another ear right here. Just want to wiggle it. You might want a drain bucket underneath. Get a little coolant. Go back and forth. And slide that off. There's where the oil pump is. And double check, just make sure the cam's lined up properly in the back. This should be flat. If you have the special tool, slide that on. But that looks good right there. And then the timing marks on the front, you should see a mark right there in about the 1 o'clock position, one right here, and a little bit before the 11 o'clock position. And down below, you should see a mark at about the 5 o'clock position. Take these two covers off, use a 6mm Allen socket. They come off pretty easily. Take this tensioner off, use a 10mm socket, take these two bolts off. Take this bracket off, use a 10mm socket, take both of those bolts out. There's a bolt in there, take that bolt out. It's for this guide right here. Just use a magnet, take that bolt out, and then slide the guide down. And there's two bolts in this guide, one here and then one down here. Use the 10mm socket. You can take that guide out. And we can take the chain off the sprocket. Take a 1-inch wrench, and I'm gonna slide that right on the cam to prevent it from spinning. If you have that lock on the back, then that's gonna help you out a little bit. And then use an 8mm Allen, take this bolt out. It's on there pretty tight. Just be careful of your fingers. You don't want the cam to move and then your fingers be caught in the gears if that happens. Take the bolt out, take the sprocket off. Now I'm going to use a 1-inch wrench. Do the same on the other cam. Hold the cam, use a 15mm socket this time. Take this sprocket off. Hold the cam from spinning. Take the bolt out and slide the sprocket off. And you can slide the chain down below and slide it out. Just cleaning up any of the RTV on here. You can just use a razor blade or a scraper. Just be careful with a razor blade. You don't want to gouge the metal and you don't want to hurt yourself. Take the timing chain and we'll just slide it in from up top. You want to make sure you have the markings of the chain facing you because you don't want to not be able to see those. Then if you twist the chain to the side a little bit, then we can go over the crankshaft. Slide it in the right area, go over here, take this sprocket, find the timing mark. We can just line this up. It's going to end up lining up right there. And get that started. And you want to make sure you replace this bolt. And we'll take the other sprocket. It's going to go on this mark. So you're going to skip a mark in between. If you count in between these, there's 7 links, or actually 6 links in between each marked one. And then you line that up right there. Get this lined up. Just like that. And again, replace this bolt as well. Now we'll take the new guides. You want to make sure that the timing marks are lined up before we set these up down below. And then again, you're going to double check and triple check these a few times. If they move, then you can adjust them. So we'll just slide this up here. Just to make it easier, I'm going to slide the chain out. You can put that on after. Get the hole lined up over here. Get this one started over here. And you can put the chain back on and just make sure that alignment is lined up. Just using a mirror, that way I can see where the alignment mark is on the chain and it's lined up with the alignment mark on the sprocket down below. So that's all set. If you had to move the chain a little bit, you can put a wrench right there and just move it slightly just to get it lined up. Make sure it's lined up right there also and right there. Now take this chain guide. This is the one that goes for the tensioner. Line that up. Take that bolt, get that started. Now take the tensioner, line this up. Just make sure that surface looks clean underneath there. Looks good. get the bolt started. Make sure all the bolts are started, and then double check your timing marks, or triple check. Now put this bracket up top. Now we're going to go back and torque all those bolts. We want to torque the tensioner to 18 foot-pounds. Then the tensioner guide bolt that's right here, we want to torque that to 107 inch-pounds. Make sure you're on inch-pounds. Then these two guide bolts, those are 89 inch-pounds. And these two guide bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Then before we pull the grenade pin, just one more time, double check the timing marks. That looks good. That one's all set, and that one's all set. So we're good to go. Just pull the grenade pin, and the tensioner should pop out. Just give it a little help. There might be a little bit of slack there. You can rotate the motor over a little bit. Just rotate, make sure none of the chains moved, or none of the chains didn't come off the sprockets, so that's good. And that's all set. So the tension's taken up there, everything's on there, just the way it should be. That's the way the tensioner should look. It should have popped out a little bit. Nothing's loose. Now we gotta torque the cam sprockets. With the wrench on the cam, you want to torque this bolt to 15 foot-pounds. And then if you have a torque angle meter, you want to go an additional 100 degrees. If you don't have a meter, do the best you can. And for this cam, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to torque this to 18 foot-pounds though, and then an additional 135 degrees. And if you had the crank bolt on there, you want to take that off at this point. Now we want to clean up the timing cover. Just clean up any of the old RTV that's on here. You can use a scraper or a razor blade. Just try to get as much up as you can. Now we're going to use some gray RTV and seal the back of the timing cover. You want to make sure you get these spots right here. Just a thin coat, not too much. Right there. That one's a little messy. And just go along here, nice thin bead. Just go around the edges of where the holes are. That should be good. Just double check, make sure it all looks good. Spot right there. Just anywhere there was RTV, that's where you want to put the RTV. Now there is a seal right there. You want to replace that seal, put a new seal in there. And if you have a crank seal, you want to replace that as well. Pop that off with a screwdriver or a pry bar and just put the new seal up and hit it on with a hammer. And a piece of wood normally works pretty well. Now just make sure everything's nice and cleaned up here. That looks good. We'll get this lined up. Might have to turn the oil pump a little bit to get that to line up. If you just used a small screwdriver in there, you can just turn the oil pump just a little bit, just to get it to work. And push that on. Then we're going to put the bolts back in. Check where the longer ones go. Make sure you put those in the right spots. Now you want to go around and torque these to 89 inch-pounds. Make sure you're on inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. Now put these covers on. Snug those down, not too tight. It is just plastic. Now I'm going to clean up all the gasket material or the RTV. Just use a scraper or a razor blade. Be careful with the razor blade. And you can use some brake parts cleaner and some rags and wipe it off afterwards. And take the oil pickup tube, put the new gasket on, line this up. Make sure the gasket's lined up. Get that bolt started first. Before I tighten that down, I will get this bolt started as well. Then we can tighten those up. And snug those up. Now we're going to clean up the oil pan. Just use a razor blade or a scraper. Just scrape up all the old RTV the best you can. Now we're going to take some RTV and just glue up the pan. Just do a nice thin bead. All right, now we're going to slide the oil pan in place. Be careful not to scrape any RTV on anything. There we go. Push it up there. That's good. And start putting the bolts back in. Make sure you get the 10mm bolts in the front. Get those started. Okay, that one. And get these two. Go in here. Get those started. Once these are all started, then start snugging them down. Now go around and torque the 13mm bolts on the sides to 18 foot-pounds. And then these ones in the back, and also the 3 10mm bolts in the front, you want to torque those to 89 inch-pounds. Now put the bell housing bolts in. And tighten these down. Now we're going to slide this in place. You can use some dish soap and some water. Help slide this in a little bit easier. Use a screwdriver. Just try to get this past. If you can get it in without dish soap, that's fine, but it just makes it a little easier. There we go. Then we're going to put the compressor bolts back in. Then we can tighten those up. All right, now with the front differential, I'm going to take the strap off from that. Slide that out of the way. Grab the differential. Make sure that bolt is in there. Just because you're not going to be able to get this bolt in afterwards. So line that up and get all the bolts started. There's a shorter one in the back and the two longer ones go in the front. There. And there should be one more, if your vehicle has it, one more higher up. Tighten those down. Tighten those all down. Now slide this shaft back in. Make sure the longer part where the splines are to this part go in first. Slides in like that. And push that in. Just like that. Now slide this piece back in position. Lined up, right spot. Put the bolts back in. And tighten these down. Now put this actuator in. And snug those bolts down. Take the connector, line the connector up, and lock it in. Now slide the steering rack in position. As you're going up, you want to make sure that it lines up top with the steering shaft. It's a little bit tricky to get this all lined up. That's lined up, and I can go up. You can get the bolts started. Just making sure nothing's binding up top. That looks good. All right, both of those are in. You can get the nuts started on the other side. Now I can lower the pull jack, get that out of the way. Now I'm going to put a socket on the other side where the nut is, and then tighten these down. Now put the power steering fluid lines back in, line those up. Wiggle those back in. Take the screw, slide that through the bracket, and tighten it down. Tighten that down. After you're done, make sure that you top off the power steering fluid and bleed the system. Now connect the steering shaft. You can put this bolt in, get that started, and tighten it down. Make sure that bolt is snug. You can put a little thread lock adhesive on that bolt and slide the boot down and make sure it seals. Good. Now slide the drive shaft in and slide that all the way on, which is good. Now slide this in place. If you marked it, slide it in the same position that it came out. Take the caps, put these on, and get the bolts started. All right, tighten those down. Slide this bracket in place. Get it lined up. Right there. Get the bolts started. Get these bolts started. And tighten these down. Now put this plate back in place, twist it. Line all those bolts up. Might have to use a hammer, give it a tap. Tap it in place, and put these bolts back in. And before we tighten those down, just get the bottom ones started. Get those all lined up. Now tighten these all down. I'm going to tighten these down. Put this cover underneath. Get the bolts started. Tighten those down. Now slide the axle in place. Line that up. Should be able to push it on. If you're struggling to get it on, just using a rubber mallet on the end of it. Just give it a few taps. Get it so it locks in. That's good. Now we can put the knuckle on. Now you need to do a combination of the axle shaft and the lower ball joint, kind of at the same time. Just raise it up. And then just make sure you have the nut in your hand so you can get it started. And just to make everything easier, put the upper ball joint in, get that started. Might have to move this a little. Hold on. Tap it down, put this bolt through. Now tighten this down. And torque it to 30 foot-pounds. Put the tie rod in. Just move the knuckle so that it lines up. Put the castle nut on. And torque it to 44 foot-pounds. Make sure the hole lines up for the cotter pin. Slide a new cotter pin through and fold over the cotter pin. Trim the excess. If the ball joint keeps spinning, you can put a jack under here and just raise it up so that it puts a little bit of pressure on the ball joint. Try to tighten it this way. And then torque it to 81 foot-pounds. And lower the pull jack. Put the rotor on. I'm just going to put a lug nut on backwards to hold the rotor on. Put the spindle nut on. Now I'm going to take a pry bar, slide it in between the lug studs, and then torque the spindle nut to 103 foot-pounds. Now take the caliper off the caliper hanger, slide it over the rotor with the brake pads in there on the bracket. Put the caliper bolts in. Now torque these bolts to 110 foot-pounds. Now take the bolts, put these bolts in for this bracket. And take the front wheel speed sensor wire, reroute that in the right position, put this clip, it's going to go through that bracket right there. This one's going to go right here. Put this one right here. Lock it down. Little bracket on the back right for that one. For actually this one. And right here. Plug that in. And push it in. And you can take this lug nut off and install the wheel. Now I'm going to torque these lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds in a cross pattern to tighten the wheel down evenly. Go around again, double check. Take the center cap, there's a key on the back that shows you where the valve stem goes. Line that up, lock it down, and you can do all the same on the other side. Now we're going to clean up the area where the valve cover gasket's going to go. Just use a rag and some brake parts cleaner. Take all the gaskets off the valve cover. You just use a pick or a screwdriver. And then you want to clean this all up. You can also take the bolts out. If you have new rubber grommets, you can replace the rubber grommets as well. Just slide those out. And I'm going to use some brake parts cleaner, clean this all up. Take these grommets off. Take the new one, slide it on, and slide it through. Now put these on, line these up. Push them down to get them to stay in place. You want to make sure it's dry. This is still a little wet. Just put it on just like that. Now put the gasket on the same way. There is a little indent right here where you can figure out which way the gasket goes. And then just the same way, just push it all in place. That's all in. Now flip it over. Be very careful that it doesn't fall out, and just slide it in position. Just wiggle it a little bit and get all the bolts started. And start tightening them down. Try to go from the center outward and tighten them down evenly. Now I'm going to go from the center, working my way out, and torque these to 89 inch-pounds. Now put the coils back, get those started. And snug those down. Do the same for the other ones. Now take the wiring harness and slide it back in position. You can push down on those tabs and then plug all the coils in. Plug the connector in for the fuel injectors and push that in place. Push this wire through the retainer right there. It's going to go for the throttle body and the map sensor. Now attach the wire right here, and that goes to the O2 sensor. Lock it down. You have another wire that runs down below. It's going to go into this retainer right here. Then it's going to connect to that oil pressure sensor down below. I'm just going to have to feel around for it. Find the tab, lock it in, and then secure it right here. This connector goes to the cam sensor. Lock that down, push the retainer in. There's a wire right here that goes to the VVT solenoid. And lock that down. Plug in the connector for the air injection solenoid and lock that down. Now before we put the intake on, we want to replace the gaskets. Just grab the old gasket, slide those off just like that. You could take a little brake parts cleaner and a rag if it's really dirty. Wipe this down. Now slide the new gasket in. There's a little tab right there that goes on that slot. And just push it all the way down. Do the same with this one. With the thermostat, you're going to do the same thing. Take the thermostat gasket off and replace it the same way as the intake gaskets. And just take some brake parts cleaner and just clean up the surface area where the gasket's going to go. If you take the map sensor off, it's going to be a little bit easier putting this back together. Just use some needle nose pliers, slide this clip off, a couple little tabs underneath, and it just slides off. So you're just squeezing those clips. And that'll give you a little more clearance. Slide it back in position. Just try to get it past that fuel line. Oops. Again, it would be easier to disconnect the fuel line, but you don't necessarily have to. In position. Now get all the bolts started. Before you tighten any of them up, just get them all at least finger tight. Now you can go around and tighten them all down. And if you can get a torque wrench in there, you want to torque those bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Do the best you can. Now move this tube, slide this out, try to hook that back up. Slide that on, that's good. Take the brake booster hose, slide that back on. Might need a hose clamp for that. And slide that back on, that's good. We're going to put the map sensor back in, line that up. Might as well plug it in right now. Line the plug up, lock it down. Take the throttle body, line it up. Get the bolts started. Nose down. Now you can torque those bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Attach the hose, lock it in, and then attach the connector, push it down, lock it down. Now take this bracket, slide it back in position. There it goes. If you took that stud off, then put that stud back on. And any of the connections underneath, you want to re-secure those. There's a couple wires that get connected. There's a bolt underneath, and then there's a stud that goes there. Put that stud on right there. Snug that down. And with the bolt, you're not going to be able to see it, but put the bolt underneath where the bracket goes. And get that tightened down. Now we're going to connect all the connectors to the computer. Get these all lined up. The white one goes first, then the gray one, and last the blue one. Get those all started, and then we'll tighten those down. Snug those down, it should be good. Now slide that over the studs, and get the bolts started. And you can put the nuts up over the studs. And tighten those down. And reattach some of the wires that are attached. That's good. Take the alternator and put the power cable on. We'll just move that wiring harness out of the way first. Take the nut, get that started. You want to clean up that terminal too if it seems like it's corroded. Just use a wire brush. And snug this nut down. Not too tight, just snug. And put this cap on. Just make sure it's not loose. It's going to go over there, the protective boot. Now we can plug in the connector, line that up, lock it down. Line the alternator up, take the bolts, one underneath, get that one started first. It's a little tricky to get to. this in the right position, then get the other top two in. Make sure those are all tight. And get this bracket lined up. Get the bolts started. Tighten those down. Now we'll take and put this stud in over here where the dipstick is. Get that started. Hold that bracket out of the way. Tighten the dipstick down and put the nut on. Tighten it down. And I'll put this bolt back in over here. Tighten it down. Just going to take a little bit of engine oil and just lubricate the sealing surface area right there. You want to replace this seal when you do this job. It's always a good idea. And slide the pulley in place. You're going to need a pulley installer that has one that has the deeper threads. And we'll tighten this down. That's going to push the crank pulley on all the way. It's all the way down. Now I can take the tool off. You want to make sure you get a new crank bolt. Put the crank bolt on. Now we want to torque the crank bolt to 110 foot-pounds, and you want to use a crankshaft pulley holding device. There's different types of brackets you can use to be able to hold the crankshaft from spinning. So torque this bolt to 110 foot-pounds. And then you want to take a torque angle meter and tighten it an additional 180 degrees. If you don't have a torque angle meter, you can mark the socket and just go a half turn. You want to clean up the surface where the water pump gasket goes. Just run a razor blade or a scraper around it and some brake parts cleaner. Just clean it up, make sure it looks good. And take the gasket. I'll take the water pump. Line the gasket up. Get the bolts started. Now torque the bolts to 89 inch-pounds. And put the pulley on. Get the bolts started. Tighten those down. If you have the special tool to hold the pulley from spinning, you can torque those bolts to 18 foot-pounds. Otherwise, do the best you can. Now take the tensioner, line that up. Put the bolt in. Now torque this bolt to 37 foot-pounds. Take the belt, we're gonna go around the alternator pulley first, then it's gonna go around the idler pulley, around the AC, and up and around the water pump. And if you still have the fan on the vehicle, you're gonna have to go around the fan and come down to the crank pulley. And over the tensioner pulley, and then we're just gonna hold tension over here. Just double check everything, make sure it's all lined up correctly. That looks good. You take your belt tensioner tool or a ratchet. And just slide it over the power steering pulley. Let off the tensioner and double check, make sure it's around everywhere. That looks good. Oh, down below. And slide the radiator in position. And before we put that radiator into those feet, we're just going to pull up the condenser. There's a couple slots in the front that the condenser has to go in. Try to get the radiator into those slots, or the condenser into the radiator slots. Right there, and right there. Get that lined up and push it down. Now put the screws in, get those started. Tighten those down. We're going to lift the radiator and condenser together. Try to get it to line up with those grommets down below. And that's sitting the way it should, right there. And reposition the radiator support and the bracket. And sneak that bolt in. It's kind of hard to see. Get that started. Before we tighten this down though, we are going to put that bracket across. Now slide this bracket in place. Get the bolts all started. And you can kind of see where the bolts were when you took it apart. You want to put that in the same spot, as close as possible. These two bolts right here. And tighten those down. While you have this all open, just double check the hood alignment. Make sure it looks like it lines up good. And that looks good right there. If you need to adjust it, if it's way off, you might want to adjust the bar a little bit. But if it's just minor adjustments, you can come over to these 3 bolts, use a 10mm socket, loosen those up, and adjust the latch accordingly. And line the grill up. Push back in place. And put these screws in. Tighten them down. I'll slide the fan and the shroud right down. And you just got to get it past where the filler neck is, where the radiator hose is going to go. And there's a couple buttons down below that need to line up on the radiator. Just try to get those to line up where it sits. You can tell they're lined up if you grab the bottom of the fan shroud and try to pull it out and it stays in position. That's good. And then right here, that just has to clip in. Still good. I'll get the fan started. Now tighten down the fan clutch onto the water pump. And if you have a wrench that fits, you can use that, or just a big adjustable. And just give it a good few taps with a hammer. If you have the ability to hold the water pump from spinning, if you have a special tool that'll hold that, then do that. But otherwise, just get this lined up. Give it a couple taps. That'll be tight. And plug the connector in. Lock it down. And put these 2 bolts in. Tighten both of those down. And put this hose on. Slide that on. If there's a clamp on there, put that clamp on. Now put the hose on. Line that up. And tighten down the clamps. Now install the intake. Line that up. Underneath here, don't forget this hose that attaches to the valve cover. There's a retainer for the wire that goes right there. Lock that down. Put the bolts in. Tighten those down. And tighten the worm clamp around the throttle body. Just snug it up. And put this hose on. Slide it in position. Connect the connector. Line this hose up. Lock it in place. And the air filter. Tighten that worm clamp down. Put the air box on over the filter. Tighten these screws down. Put this bar in place and put the 2 bolts in. Tighten those down. The other one that goes right here. Connect the battery. Line up the terminal and snug that up. Make sure it's tight. Now we can put the transmission fluid cooler lines. Get those secured in the radiator. Just press those in. Push this little cap over. Same on this one. Make sure they're locked in there correctly. There is a bracket up here. Just make sure the lines are in that bracket. Just like that. Take the clamp, put the clamp over the hose. Get the hose on the radiator. And tighten down the clamp. Just snug and just make sure it's not loose. That looks good. Now add your appropriate coolant and level. You want to make sure you put the radiator cap back on, snug it up. Make sure you add fluid over where the reservoir is to the appropriate level. You want to make sure you run the vehicle for about 10 minutes, constantly checking to make sure it's not overheating and looking at the level. You never want to open the radiator cap when it's hot. After it's run about 10 minutes and the engine's warmed, you can shut the vehicle down, let it cool down, and adjust the levels accordingly. You want to check the transmission fluid and adjust the level accordingly. You want the vehicle running and with it in park while it's warmed up. Pull the dipstick tube out. Check the level, make sure it's in between those 2 spots, those hash marks, and adjust accordingly. To fill the transmission fluid, use a skinny funnel that'll actually fit where the dipstick goes and add the appropriate fluid. You want to top off the power steering fluid. Take the cap off, put a funnel in there, put the appropriate amount of fluid in there. With the two front wheels raised off the ground, turn the steering wheel back and forth 10 to 15 times. Then recheck the power steering fluid, adjust accordingly, start the vehicle, turn the wheel back and forth, shut it down again, and adjust again. Remove the oil cap, use a funnel, add the appropriate type of oil and the amount of oil, put the cap back on, start the vehicle, run it for about 10 to 15 seconds, shut it off, and check the oil level at the dipstick.